Let me introduce our speakers for this evening. Joining us here is Dr. Irving Finkel, who is the Assistant Keeper of Ancient Mesopotamian Script, Languages and Culture at the British Museum. In 2007, along with Dr. Polly North, he founded the Great Diary Project, which rescues, archives, and makes publicly available a growing collection of more than 19,000 published diaries. Also joining us this evening is Roland Allen. Roland is a publisher and author, and his book, this very one here, that you can also buy at the end of the talk, from the lovely David from Newham Bookshop on the side. Support your local bookshops, guys. The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper, is an exploration into the creative and wonderful ways notebooks, in all of their variety, have been used throughout history and what they can tell us today. Give a warm welcome, please, to both of us. It's such a pleasure to have you with us, folks. I'd love to just begin by asking you each to just set out a little bit of groundwork for us. Tell us a little bit more about your projects. Irving, can we start with you? Could you tell us a little bit more about the Great Diary Project? Where did it begin, and where have you got to?
Well, the thing is that I read dead inscriptions in the British Museum from the BC period, and I'm very used to the idea of a thing about that big, which is full of words, out of which you have to screw meaning like water out of a sponge. That's what I do for a living. And I've never written a diary. Nobody in my family has ever written a diary. But what happened to me was a guy who made a living out of maps and miscellaneous bits of paper came once to see me in the British Museum in a foul temper. I've known him for a long time. And it transpired that he'd been somewhere in the West Country and bought a whole box of diaries. There were 76 of them, in fact, from about 1880 to about 1950, all belonging to one person. And he bought it as a speculation, and he realised that the guy had been at Harrow School, he'd been in the First World War and the Second World War, and he'd been shooting animals in India. It was one of those English sort of chaps that Monty Python takes the piss out of, but actually he was rather a nice bloke, I think. Anyway, what he'd done is this is the important point. Being a sensible and responsible individual, had taken these army diaries, so to speak, to the Imperial War Museum, thinking they would like them for their collection and give him 10 quid on top. But what happened was they kept them like museums do for 2 or 3 years without any word, and then they said, well, we'll have 1914 to 18 and 1939 to 1945, and you can throw the rest away. And this was a response from a national repository of human history. So he didn't. And he came to see me. So I said, I'll buy them. And I did. And something happened, just like on that whim. It was quite a whim because they were rather heavy, that all of a sudden I had this kind of vision. And I thought to myself this. Firstly, how marvellous. So I'm going to collect as many diaries as possible because I'm a curator. That's what curators do. They are voracious. They don't take any notice of the law. They don't take any notice of morals, and especially not ethics. You just get everything you possibly can. So this is what I thought I would do until one day another light bulb went on, and I realised I didn't just want to get the biggest collection. I wanted to rescue diaries that nobody wanted. And that was a mature kind of conception, which led to the Great Diary Project, which is now in Bishopsgate Institute. And so with the people there, we formulated a plan. And my plan was really very simple, that anything that was a diary, looked like a diary, might have been a diary, or could conceivably even possibly be part of a diary, should be rescued forever and ever. So it was a non-discriminatory, non-political, non-religious, non-nothing, just looking for diaries for the long-term future. So I grew up in a building, I won't go on for long, I grew up in a building where actually we care about unborn babies, and so forth. We're not interested in the world now or politics, and let alone politics now. We've got this view of rescuing stuff for the long-term future of mankind's achievements. And diaries are not only a part of it, but they're a part of it which has been massively underappreciated by the public at large, and especially by historians, because historians are really only interested in famous people, historical people, or political people, or any of those, most of whom are arrant liars. And what we want is the diaries of everybody else. Nobody wrote a diary to have it printed or published. It's just real diaries of real people. And there are thousands of them. I couldn't get Polly on the phone, but they've come in a pretty continuous stream and it's something like over 20,000 diaries. And sometimes there's only one, sometimes there's a whole row. And so this mad idea of mine bore fruit. And this is something interesting, because everybody experiences this stupid remark, like somebody really ought to stop dogs shitting on the pavement, all those sorts of ideas. And this is the only time when I had that sentiment where I did something about it. In all of my marriage, I've never done anything about it, but this worked. And Polly and Stefan together, a fantastic team. So that's it. And that's what they do. And it just goes on and on and on, and it's marvellous. So,
fantastic. It's a remarkable project, and we're definitely going to delve a little further into it as we go through the talk. Roland, I would love to. I've spent a very enjoyable festive break reading your book, and it's very clear that it's an immensely personal. You have an immensely personal connection to notebooks in the way of writing, and indeed you publish as well as working in publishing your books. You publish notebooks as well.
Very unsuccessfully, yeah. I tell the story in the introduction of the company I worked for. We tried to take on Moleskine in about 2013 or 2011, and I duly slept around the United States speaking to book buyers and Barnes and Noble and people like that. Complete failure, absolute failure. Very chastening actually, but very educational as well.
Yeah, it really comes across in the book. Your immense kind of personal connection with this topic. I'd love to hear a little about how that journey went. How did you get from this kind of personal inspiration, personal interest to what is a book that covers an enormous breadth, really, of very detailed and very entertaining information about notebooks?
I guess I've got props. Did he bring props?
No. Actually, I thought the plan was you're my prop, and that's the whole idea.
So I guess, and the big answer to your question is, I suppose that there was one sort of emotional starting point to the journey, and then there was a sort of a light bulb moment. And the emotional starting point was when I came into these, or started reading these, and these are my grandfather's diaries from 38, 39, and 40. Don't worry, you'll get hold of them eventually. They'll go into the Great Diary Project. And I never really knew my grandfather. He died when I was very young. And these diaries, as you can see, are very minimal, and you don't get very much of an entry. But he didn't censor himself, and he gave a very full picture of his life, which was really interesting at the time, and obviously these were interesting times to be alive. And I felt that I had got to know him, and inspired by them, I started my own diary. This isn't the first one, actually. On the I never reread my diaries, but on the train on the way up, I reread January from 2003, which absolutely humiliating experience. I mean, how wrong I was about everything. So I'm not going to do that again. But again, you'll get these in due course, so keep your eyes off them. So I kept a diary for years and became very interested in it. And because I was working in a creative industry and constantly meeting illustrators, particularly designers, web designers, graphic designers, painters who taught how to paint, that sort of thing. All of them depended on their notebooks, and I found that very interesting. I also found it very interesting that the people who I most enjoyed working with also tended to be wed to their moleskins. They'd be very good at writing lists and crossing things off. They'd always walk around with their notebook. And then I guess the light bulb moment was one day, I was made redundant. And then one day when I was thinking about all this stuff, it occurred to me that they had to have been invented. They're such a common thing, such a simple thing. We see them every day. Everyone in this room probably has at least one on them in a quite normal way. No one's ever really stopped and thought where they actually came from. And it was surprisingly hard to find out. And by the time I'd found out, roughly speaking, where they came from, it was clear that there was a story and it was clear that there was a book.
It's fascinating, and it's as I say, it's a really beautiful collection of stories and a really fascinating journey through time. But there is the first thing that came to my mind when we discussed, this idea for this talk, and I got more acquainted with both of your work, is the complexity around collecting diaries and using diary material. I'm sure that I'm not alone in this room with having this kind of instinctive view of a diary as something extremely intimate and extremely private, and how we square that with the process of collecting. There's a really lovely quote in your book, which I'm actually going to read out, which I thought really well illustrated how people may feel about their own diaries. This is from Magdalena van Schijn in 1788. The opening address you have written to the notebook itself. "Oh, my paper, henceforth you shall be the only one to hear my ideas, my cares and joys. Here I will be able to pour out my soul entirely. With others, even with my best friends, I want to learn how to hide things, or at least I no longer want to tell them about myself. You alone will be my confidant. When my heavy heart longs to unburden itself, you will not cruelly reject it. You will not misinterpret what I confide in you. When my pen is borne along by happiness, you will not have a morbid talent for snuffing it out in an instant. I will have you by my side always to turn to when in need." And I think that is a really wonderful illustration of how personal and how sacred that kind of diary space can be viewed as. So how do you both, Irving, when you are collecting, in terms of your collections policy and how you work with that material, and in terms of, for you, Roland, when you're researching, how do you navigate those complexities around what is something very intimate and may never have, as you say, never have designed to be read, with sharing that with others?
Well, there's a whole load of stuff in that question. Normally speaking, a person's diary when they are alive is sacrosanct, and nobody would surreptitiously read somebody else's diary under any circumstances, else they'd be shot. So that is a fixed rule. But my idea is that when the diary is alive and the person is alive, this is a different arena for consideration from when the person is dead. Because when the person is dead, so is the diary. So in my scale of values, when the person has died, their diary moves from primary responsibility for privacy to a different kind of privacy, which is as follows. If you found a diary written in 1286, which talked about bodily functions and the divorce plan and money and all those sorts of secret things.
Well, that would have been a massive historical anomaly.
Look, whose side are you on? This is our side, right? Okay, don't start.
1586, and we're good.
Fine, you're on. But the principle is such that no one would scruple to read what had been a very private diary after a very long interval of time. So that means that the privacy kind of evaporates. And the question is, how long does it last? So if you have a diary from 1837, no one would worry. And if it was 1896, no one would worry. If it was 1934, 1942, no one would hesitate for a moment. If it was 2 weeks old, you might feel a bit squeamish. But it seems to me that there's a great deal of sentimentality that floats around this issue. And sometimes when people write that kind of precious stuff at the beginning of their diary, they are very complacent about their own self and what they are doing. And it doesn't make any sense to me, because a declaration of this kind is actually not directed to the book or to themselves, but to some reader. So I have a kind of wishy-washy psychological conviction that actually there's a big thing in the world about no one should ever read anybody else's diaries, and nobody wants anybody else to read anybody else's diaries. But when you say you don't want somebody to do something, it often means that you actually do. So I wonder. So, for example, my perspective on everything in the world is of a Martian anthropologist who lands in a spaceship and has 5 minutes to sum everything up. So let's say in a historical period when this was still relevant, you might find somebody with a book and a pen writing in it. And all other examples of writing with an implement on a surface are designed for readers, all of them. So then you'd have a very anomalous situation that this thing, which people might conduct for the whole of their lives, is in a different sphere. I don't believe it. I think there is, in all diarists, a perhaps never articulated and never transparent idea that they really hope that somebody will read them. So scientifically, in a laboratory, we can posit who these readers might be. So, for example, you have somebody who has a diary. Many people I know would rather die than have their children read their diary. But this is a special case. And actually, if it turns out that they ever get grandchildren, I think if when they're 97 and their 7-year-old granddaughter is sitting on the end of the bed reading out the diary and saying, "Granny, did you really do that?" they will be immensely gratified. This is one thing. The second thing is that lots of diarists say at the beginning, not that stuff, which I think is rather malodorous, but I am writing this diary so that my descendants will know what happened in 1756, how it was that they're fat, and so forth. So they're all really complicated issues. But in my opinion, if you're trying to rescue diaries, you are on the side of the diarist, because people who write diaries and die very often don't write anything else in the world. And people get turned into dust and they disappear and records become... And sometimes the diaries I have are the only single thing representing this individual apart from their loathsome children and their loathsome children and all of that. But there's something sacred about them because they become like messages where privacy is completely irrelevant, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention about, the desire for some of these things to be passed on to children, to descendants. One of the things which was entirely new to me in your book, Roland, was please excuse my pronunciation, Zibaldone. How's my pronunciation of that?
I always say that you should pronounce it as though you're in an Italian restaurant, and then you'll be fine.
Okay, we'll go with that. Apologies if we have anyone who's an Italian speaker in the room and I've just grossly offended. But this idea of what appeared to me almost a form of scrapbooking, which was designed to be shared, but within limits, within family or familial boundaries. Could you share with us a little bit about that practice and your thoughts on it?
Well, this is definitely not a diary, but it is a personal notebook, and it's where you would collect interesting things that you had read. And this is pre-printing, so we're talking about Florence around the year 1300 and onwards. And if you wanted to own a book, or if you wanted to own literature, then you either had to pay to have it copied, which was expensive, or you had to copy it yourself, which is fairly boring if you're doing a long thing, but it's quite bearable if you're doing a short thing. And so people copied short things. They would copy their favourite bits of Dante, who was a contemporary, he was from that period. They would take their favourite prayers, they would take their favourite bits of Ovid, Aesop's Fables, things like that, collect them all in their Zibaldone, and Zibaldone, the restaurant reference, wasn't entirely facetious. It seems to have meant salad. And that's the idea of the book, that it's like a salad. It's thrown together randomly, there's no order to it, no organisation, it's just what you'd like to read and would like to read again. And in one corner, just this one corner of the world, Florence, sort of 1300 to about 1500, everyone kept a Zibaldone. It was totally normal, and it was what you did in the pre-print age if you wanted to have literature. And we know from the wills, which survive in Florence quite well, that most people who died left 2 or 3 books. And the very idea that, in Europe at that time, most people, cobblers, were leaving 2 or 3 books behind them, which is extraordinary by comparison with the rest of the continent. So it was a really important part of this super literacy there, and I think then that gives you an audience which is ready for Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch, etc., and sort of modern European literature. Yes, so not diaries though.
No, it does seem that there's something in there which is, I hesitate to say performative, but I mean that is outward looking. That it is also, if you're sharing this document with people, it's also saying something about you.
Yeah, and there's something in lots of those that you never see in diaries, which is the handover point, which is when the handwriting goes, and then the father will say, I now hand this Zibaldone over to my son. And then another son will step in and say, actually, no, he left it to me. And I don't know, actually, have you seen any diaries handed down generationally like that?
No, most people die without making any arrangement. And sometimes they instruct their solicitor that they want their diaries to be burned after their death. And I have a plan to go to a legal conference and berate all the solicitors in Britain not to do anything of the kind. And they will say that's their job. But if you say, I want my dog to be put down, they don't put the dog down because dogs are more important than human beings. Well, in my opinion, diaries are more important than dogs. So I suggest that we change the bylaw so they are entitled to take no notice and send them to us. Now, about this reading literature thing, throughout the second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, many printed diaries that people bought to keep their entries in have bits at the back for books read.
Oh, do they?
Yes, usually just titles, and then, of course, sometimes films read. The one that really made me laugh was, I had a book of a diary of a schoolgirl, I suppose about 15 or something like that, and in the back, it had books read, and there was a column for fiction and non-fiction. And under fiction, she wrote, I don't read fiction, I'm a clergyman's daughter. And the writing quivers with a kind of self-righteous quiver. So that's rather interesting.
Yeah.
It made me, the thing that the reading about this kind of, this format made me think about actually was Pinterest and how people curate their own kind of Pinterest boards. Obviously, we're talking more of in aesthetics here, but it did make me think about what the impact of how much of our lives currently, how much of the documentation of our lives currently takes place in digital spaces, and what this might mean for the future of diaries, for the future of kind of collecting these kind of records. Are we seeing fewer people who are writing diaries by hand? Are people keeping them? Yeah. I would love to hear where you're at. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I've got my own. Having written this book, I'm thrown into sort of rooms full of people who keep diaries and love the idea. And I go to things like stationery conferences where everyone is, sticking things in journals and things like that. I'm quite optimistic, therefore, about the future of the written diary. When Irving and I spoke before this, we both agreed that it was impossible, basically, to type a diary. I think there are probably exceptions in the case of people who, for instance, can type but can't handwrite. But
well, actually, in about 20 years' time, that will be everybody.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting thing that the root of the problem about the shift from a manuscript diary to the computer screen is the following: that many people got up, had breakfast, went to work, came home, had dinner, watched television, went to bed, as a daily entry. And I have the conception in my mind that if you have a diary of this size, where there's only a few days, you can write something like that, or variants in a jazz-like way of it, like had a second cup of tea or something like that, or something, mowed the dog, whatever it is, but all those sorts of things. And they are, on the whole, mundane, to the point that most people would not find them interesting unless they have an enlightened view like us. But the point about it is that you cannot type, got up, went to work, came home on a computer, and then rule off the second, and then next third. You just can't do it, because you're going to look at that screen and you are going to say, what am I doing? And there's a special clause in nature which means that most diarists don't ask themselves what I'm doing. They just do it. They get swept into it, and then they live in a position where they can hardly go to bed without doing it, like cleaning your teeth. It becomes a rhythm of life, and what starts out in a rather sentimental way as my friend becomes something very important to people, which is not just friendship. It's an interesting psychological matter. So You can't do that on a computer. You just can't. Another second thing about it, just a minute. I just thought something. The other second thing about it is if you type something on a computer, the bloody machine corrects your words. So you can't have an abbreviation. You can't put a full stop in the right place. The thing. So it's between you and the record is the damn machine. That's the second point. And the third thing is millions of people have said to me, oh, well, we know people don't keep diaries anymore, but they keep blogs, don't they? And there's a kind of confusion in the world that the diary is an old-fashioned thing and the blog is the modern equivalent. Now, if we just resuscitate the idea that when you write a diary, nobody else reads it, or maybe one or two people, maybe, with a blog, the whole idea is as many people on the globe are supposed to read it. So that means that the function of a blog, at least in the original kind of blog, now people use it as a kind of platform for ideas. But when it started out, what I did in my day, I didn't iron my sheets, I did this, I didn't do this. And that was a kind of peripheral moment when it was like trying to transpose the thing on. And I came to the conclusion that blog stands for an interesting conception, which is a bloody load of old guff. Because the whole thing is manipulative. Because when you write something, knowing they're going to be readers, you lose the sort of virginity of expression. Because when you have a sensation that someone's going to read it, or you hope half of America reads it, the purity of the private diary vanishes forever. Because you manipulate things. And the normal, real diarist does not manipulate the text because there isn't any point, in my opinion.
I love the idea of the virginity of the text. I'm going to take that. The virginity of the expression. That's it.
Please.
But there's also the totally different aspect to doing it by hand in a diary, which is you're making something by hand. So my sister-in-law, every Friday night, she goes and does a pottery class, and she's making one by one a set of cereal bowls and then cups to go with them. And everyone knows that they're going to come out and they're going to be clunky, not structurally sound cereal bowls. But they're going to be, for her, infinitely superior than anything she could have got from Habitat. And that's, I think everyone would understand that. And there's something about making a physical object with your hands and completing it and finishing that diary, which is profoundly satisfying, or finishing a notebook, actually, a creative notebook, I find as well, just as painting a picture is, or drawing a picture, and I've never found that level of satisfaction from typing anything.
I think it will be really interesting to review, see where this conversation is, in 50 years' time. Yeah. I think that there is naturally retains
I'm looking forward to that.
You'll still be with us. But as in school, I learned to write, and that the first writing that I did was by hand. I'm sure that that's true of a lot of us. If we've got any very young folks in the audience, it may be that even in primary schools, most of your work is done on computer. But equally, I think that...
both of my children finished primary school fairly recently, being very good at PowerPoint. PowerPoint.
Yeah. But that will be, I think, very interesting journey to track. But I think as well, there's something in here about the question of what is a diary. Because, of course, there is the diary that is I'm recording what is happening. There is the diary I'm making note of, I got up, I walked the dog, I did whatever in my day. But then there's also the sense of a diary, or the journal, perhaps, as we tend to be calling it.
I don't want to have to interrupt here, but I think I have to, because I haven't got a book here yet. But next time, there'll be one. So it's jolly hard writing a book about diaries, but one of the things which is a central framework is in this book is the question of truth, and then the thing that you've just alluded to. So I have this idea, there are 3 categories of private diary of real people, disregarding all the manipulators. So one is, as you say, the appointment diary, which is what I should do, what I'm supposed to do. Then you get the daily events diary, which is what I did. And then you get the personal diary, which is who I am. And those are the 3 tranches of documentation that you find in normal private diaries of normal persons. And of course, they're not hewn in stone. There's always overlap between the three. So people might have an appointment diary full of half-finished sonnets to somebody in the office that he really fancies, which is not normally part of a diary entry, and all those other things, but those three distinctions. So this is interesting, because if you have a big collection of historical diaries, what you might expect to get out of them varies. So there's no point in trying to persuade someone how marvellous these diaries are. Look at this appointment diary from 1957, which says, I think I need some new shoes. I'm going to the dentist next month and better clean my teeth, that kind of stuff. And people think it's an absolute joke. But the central point, from the point of view of a historian or a sociologist or a thinker who finds himself presented with this tumbling waterfall of increasing volume of diaries from the 18th century, sometimes 19th loads and 20th century loads, and some of the present century, about not so much what are you doing by writing them, but what can we look for them? And a very central issue is the question of truth, because historians, for example, spend all their time chasing their tail about trying to establish the truth about anything that happened in the past, oblivious to the fact that it's impossible to establish the truth about what happened in the past. We all know that when we're grown up. So the thing is about diaries, you don't expect anything but the actual truth from what am I to do? What am I supposed to do? The appointments diary. Anybody who lies about things in an appointments diary should be in a home. Then we have the what I've done, and the extent to which you might attribute some kind of manipulation to that category depends on the extent to which you think it's likely that anybody else will read it, because if you use what I've done as a manipulative thing, it can be analysed in two ways. One is a person writes things like that which they want to manipulate their own confidence and all that kind of stuff. Like, I got off with this fantastic girl at a party, I never thought I would, when he didn't. And that wouldn't be a lie so much as a piece of practical magic. So this is all very complicated. But the third thing, who am I, is, of course, the most interesting section from the point of view of a later reader. And there we have to brace ourselves to confront whether this group of diaries has the same quotient of truth element as the other two, where you can more or less take them for granted. So unless you have somebody who is deeply disturbed or has an agenda, when people write about who I am, it ought to be classifiable by and large as the truth as they understand it. So you have in diary study, in my opinion, you have to give the stage to this concept of truth as far as the diarist saw it. So you can easily, with the benefit of wider hindsight, see that what they said there was wrong and so forth. And of course, you do get the occasional instance of somebody who makes the rash step of reading their own diary from an earlier period and is filled with self-disgust and doesn't know what to do about it and is now seeking intellectual help. So that's part of the thing. But so if, as we do, we don't take diaries from politicians or writers or anybody in the public mind who use words for manipulation, and we only work with, as you put it, cobblers, taxi drivers, clergymen, all sorts of other persons who don't write with the idea of publication, that's the most important thing, then you can take whatever they say, even if it's surprising, at face value, as long as you're sensible about it. I have to say, in Bishopsgate, we have some very remarkable diaries, and 2 points should be stressed. One is, 3 points should be stressed. No, 4 points should be stressed. The first thing is that a diarist retains copyright of their diary for 75 years post-mortem. So that's quite a troublesome thing, because you don't know usually when they died even. Sometimes you don't even know who they were. So this is a grey area, but you cannot quote somebody's diary until that period of time has elapsed. Only if the copyright of the diary comes with the diary to Bishopsgate. So we have this form, which is supposed to look as friendly as possible, about surrendering the copyright, because people immediately think of Hollywood movies and, and all this kind of, but no diary really has ever come to light which is worth more than 5 pence in the commercial world. So if we get the copyright, then it becomes a tool that people can use historically, and they jolly well do. So I've lost the thread of my point. What was the other point?
You had 4 points.
I know, quick, think of something. It's too complicated to do.
I've got 2 I can step in with.
Go on, please, my dear.
So to go back to your question, I've got my own working definition of a diary as opposed to another notebook or a daily notebook or any other kind of daily record, is that it needs to have some record of your interior life as well as a record of your exterior life, which may be public affairs, which may be war, whatever is. Going quite far back in history, you have chronicles where the same person will write about exterior events all for years and years and years indefinitely, and never mention themselves once. And I don't count those as a diary.
I agree.
I think it has to have some kind of internal thing. And likewise, I think there probably are diaries out there which have nothing external at all, when you've just got one person looking at their soul. And I think that's sort of equally difficult. But the other thing relating to your thing about truth is that there's a really interesting philosophical insight from the 90s from Clark and Chambers, the most frequently cited philosophical paper of the 1990s, apparently, which extends the mind, philosophically speaking, outside your head, outside your brain, your skull, and into whatever it is you're writing on at that point. Because, and the way they puzzle this out is to say, well, that's where your beliefs lie. Where do your beliefs lie? Normally we think of them as lying, by which they mean our perception of truth. So gravity, my trust in gravity is a belief. I believe Irving's got a suit on. So all of my truth, as you put it, my beliefs, can be extended outside because half of them are in here too. And that's, I think, when diaries get really, really interesting, or when notebooks get really interesting, when they're sort of this extension of the mind. Can you recall your other 3 points?
Well, I was going to say that the reasons why people do write diaries seriously are not all the same. What I don't like is to give any kind of room to the idea that there are as many diaries as there are people, because that is just mush. But people often say that when you try and say something. Well, that's rubbish. But the thing is, there's no question that some people use a diary for purgative reasons and to deal with very serious inner disturbance in that way, and lock it up and hide it and hope nobody reads it. And it really is a private thing, and there's not going to be anything else to be said about it. But that's not the normal use of diaries that come to light. I think what is the general truth is that people use their diary for a mixture of those 3 principles. And if you have an appointment diary and you have something to wrestle with, you might write it in the back with plain passage or just addresses and this. So there's all sorts of stuff that comes in them. It's not like anybody lays down the law about it. Oh, I had another idea. It is astonishing how many people say, got up, had breakfast, went to work, all that kind of stuff. Maybe for 40 years with slight variation, without hesitation, repetition, or what's the other thing? Yeah. So anyway, this is interesting. So I have 2 theories about why this might happen. Firstly, you have diary families where a kid gets given a diary when it can read and write on its own, chew gum and so forth. Now you're one of us, you have to keep this diary. So the kid opens the nice diary, chews the pencil within an inch of its life, and then says, what am I supposed to write in this diary? And whenever somebody is asked this question, the answer must always have been, write down what you've done. It must always have been, that's the basic thing, write down what you've done. So that's the core that spreads out into the different categories and far beyond. So I think it's that simple because it's a simple question and it's a simple answer. But there is wonderful historical precedent, because if you look on the internet, you will discover that Princess Beatrice, who was one of Victoria's daughters, was given the charge of publishing her mother's diaries. So she spent a happy decade or so expurgating anything of any remote interest so she could publish the rest. And what was interesting is that the diary entry when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, that diary entry is immaculate. And in order to get you to subscribe to this thing, which of course is very costly if you want to do so, they put this juicy plum on the website so people, oh gosh, it sounds really interesting. Anyway, the thing is, at the bottom there's a really rather skillful drawing of Queen Victoria in her wedding dress, in ink, just drawn like that without any hullabaloo. And it begins like this: got up, had breakfast, just like any other day. And so I suppose anybody who sees that thinks, well, I've been doing the right thing all along. I mean, it's like the most amazing. But, this is a really interesting thing that people do this. And it really is worthy of analysis. And I've come to the conclusion that it's a kind of mantra to preserve existence. It's a kind of fluent rock, which the reiterated pattern of existence, as it builds up behind and it promises the future, is some kind of element about it which has this quality, so that the historical facts in it are not quite the same. So if you're a sensible person in the modern age, if you read back over a diary and you see that you got up 362 days of the year, you might say to yourself, well, look, from now on, I won't mention getting up, so that if I don't get up, I'll write it in. You see, so that's what the computer would have you do. They would manipulate you in that kind of a bookkeeping way so that the actual function of the diary will be obliterated. I'll give you another illustration. Comedians and foreigners, rather similar kind of race of species, make fun of conversations in Britain mercilessly. For example, if you cross the road to wait for the bus in the morning and there's a person at the bus stop and it's absolutely pouring with rain, so by the time you get to the bus stop, you are absolutely soaked as well. You can put £1 million down, bet that the person would say, wet, isn't it? So this is a truism of demonstrable type, and there's no possibility that the person was wrong, or that the person thought that I, if it was me, hadn't noticed that I'm streaming with water, and also, and all that kind of thing. So in other words, there's lots of mundane communication which has a psychological value over and above what it looks like. Because if you were to go to a bus stop where there was a person there and say, it's a trifle windy, isn't it? They'd move away from you because that's not an established method of communication. So they think you were some kind of wind fetishist, and they wait to see if you went upstairs and they definitely sit downstairs, because you can't start a conversation with people you don't know except in that magic circumstance when the actual bridging phraseology is totally superfluous. So it has a different function, and I think the common type of diary entry is an example of it. Of course, it's not relentless, because you might have a lady who keeps a diary about going to the bar, going to have a haircut, and this, that, and this, that, and the other, and then sort of in late November says, saw God in the garden. And you don't know anything more about it. And you read it, did I read this right? And then was there a new religion? Turn to the back and think, no, that was just it. And so actually the truth is that if you're hostile to this, you could go into the diary and pick anything off the shelf, say, what on earth? Why are we taxpayers? Actually, they're not supporting it. But why are we paying for this kind of rubbish? Chuck it all out. But the thing is, this is the true thing. Any diary will have something really interesting in it. And the quality of interest depends on the reader. So, for example, say you're writing a book about the history of London transport, which would be a very miserable activity. You can find out about the frequency of bus journeys or deliveries of mail. In London, you used to get 4 deliveries of mail a day. People wrote to the British Museum in the 19th century, "Dear Dr. Budge, I find myself somewhat inconvenienced this morning with a cough, so perhaps I won't be in before 10:30. Now, imagine writing a letter and posting that and expecting it to have any function. And so you don't know about the Victorian Post. You might find about it in a novel, but actually you can find in something simple like that a whole new understanding of a million things. So I think we'll never throw anything away, because you never know what will be of interest to some reader, because they're kind of, each one of them is a witness to a gone age, so to speak.
Just before we open to questions, I have just one thing I'd love to return to, is it's a question that we discuss a lot here at Conway Hall, both in terms of what we do in our programme day to day, but also very much with our library and archive, which is whose story gets told? Who do we hear from? And as we all know, in traditional publishing, both historically and indeed still today, some voices get heard a lot more than others, and some don't get heard at all. Now, Irving, you've mentioned, you're very much focused on everyday people. I would love to hear from you both whether you are seeing trends throughout history in the diaries you have uncovered over who is writing them. Are some people writing them more than others? Are we seeing, the divides that we see in publishing in other areas, as opposed to gender, as opposed to class, as opposed to all of the various other barriers that face people in publishing, are they reflected in who is keeping diaries? Or is it the wonderful outlier that is entirely democratic?
But the thing is, with the case of actual diaries, it's diabolically difficult to establish it, because there's no such thing as a diarist's walk. So that you could be going down the street and you see somebody with a particular kind of swing of the hip and you know they were a diarist. There's no external clue. And also, people never talk about keeping a diary.
No, we've got one, actually. We just haven't told you about it.
So I think what you need is a helicopter with a megaphone. But the hunch I have on the basis of the stuff I've looked at is, it's not true that more women are diarists than men. That's a kind of thing that people often expect to be the case, but I don't think it's true. So that demolishes, lots of people say that is a fact about, but I don't think it is true, and it's certainly not substantiable. Can't be substantiated. But go on, about time you said something.
The central point is, it's impossible to know. I will say that in terms of when you have a community that suddenly becomes marginalised, then people start writing diaries. And the example which is easiest is that of people during wartime. And for instance, the Jewish population of Europe during the last World War suddenly took up diary writing en masse for different reasons. I think partly to sort of relieve internal stress in a way which was sort of discreet and secretive, and sadly often because they knew that they weren't going to survive and they wanted their something to bear witness later on. But those, I suppose, are as marginalised as people get, and under those circumstances. But I think it's slightly different in the sense that most of them came from a place initially where they weren't marginalised, certainly not to that extent, and therefore they had lost something. Whether or not someone who starts off at the margins is more likely to feel that impulse, I don't know.
Please join me in giving a massive thank you to Roland.